Alright guys, everyone get settled, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming to the pizza lectures. This is Craig Appel, he's an engineer at Cisco. He's going to be talking a little about what he does day to day and what you can take away from your college experience. So everybody, Craig.
Just get a sense of who we have in the room. How many of you are like freshmen and sophomore? Raise your hand. Show of hands. Okay, how many of you are like seniors? Juniors. Didn't forget you. Any graduate students? Okay. How many of you are science, math majors? Okay, most of you, and the rest are liberal arts. All right, that's important, I think, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about, it does matter what your major is doing and some of the other stuff you're doing, the non-technical stuff, how important that is. So I do want to get to that. Okay, so I'm Craig Appel, as he said. I'm an engineer at Cisco, and I'm just going to cover in I'm just going to cover a couple of things. My background, right? And I'm going to cover maybe a few little nuggets of wisdom that I've learned over the last 25 years working. What a normal work day for an engineer looks like. I think sometimes when I was in college, I had no idea what we actually do every day. So it'd be kind of interesting to know what we do every day on a daily basis, you know. What is a product cycle is how do we actually make things, you know. All of you guys, you tend to take a lot of different classes, and they don't really fit together. You don't really know how it goes from like a physics class, a math class, an English class. How does that actually turn into something you make as a product, and how do we actually see it in the Apple store or wherever it is that you see those things. So I want to go through a product cycle so you just have a sense of how that works. And then I want to talk about what does an engineering career look like. So not just a day-to-day, but like a 25-year or 40-year career in engineering. What does it typically look like? What are people doing? And then a little bit on life balance and how to make this all work. And I think that's just as important as some of the other technical things that I'll cover. Okay? So I just want to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk, all right? First thing I'll tell you is a little bit about me. Okay, so I've been working in IC design. For those of you who don't know what IC stands for, it stands for integrated circuit. Okay, I work in IC design circuit for the last 25 years. I work at Cisco now. I used to work at Intel for a while. And I worked at AT&T in Lucent, Finland. And I also joined a startup 7 or 8 years ago called Likewise. And I'll tell you a little more about the startup for those of you who are interested in startups and stuff like that. And then I work mainly now on the backbone of the internet, so the data centers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with data centers, where all of your data gets aggregated and switched and sent around. So that's the primary area I work, so it's not something you would see on a daily basis. But in the past, I used to work with cell phones. I bet you all of you have owned a cell phone, probably a chip that I worked on is in one of those cell phones, almost guaranteed. Okay. So I worked on cell phones, and I work now on optical modules. I worked on an example of a really small optical module, that's like one of these things here. Fiber comes in on that side, so the light comes in on that side, and then on the other side, the electronics goes out, okay? And these things typically will plug into a big rack of switches, and the fiber will connect everything, you know. So the reason we use fiber, by the way, is fiber, going through a fiber has very low losses, so it can go very far. So you can get a fiber light to go thousands of kilometers underwater or across the ocean. You can get it to go, you know, across things, whereas if you try to do it with a copper wire, it just goes a few meters and you start losing your signal very quickly. So we do a lot of stuff through fiber, especially when it's the backbone of the network. Okay. My personal background is I went to State University of New York for I started off as a math major. Many of you may start with a math major. Somewhere along the line I figured I struggled to get a job, so I switched to an engineering major, and then I ended up doing a double major in math and engineering. Okay, so that's my background. I then did a master's at Cornell in electrical engineering, and then a PhD at Columbia. Right? So that's where I'm at. It's a non-thesis PhD, and there's a reason I did a non-thesis PhD, because I'm already working. I already have a job. So the thesis would actually just mean I'd have to take time from work. Okay, it wouldn't buy me any more from where I am. At some point, just as a translation, usually 1 or 2 years working is equivalent to like a master's or something, or maybe 3 years is equivalent to master's, 5 or 6 years is equivalent to PhD. And they'll, salary-wise and everything will adjust that way. So after you've done, 25 years, it doesn't really matter if you do a PhD. It just doesn't factor in at all, okay? So I work on transceivers. Transceiver is basically a transmitter and a receiver. So the transmitter send and the receiver is receiving. Okay. It works very high data rates, so much more than faster than you'd ever see. So the low data rate. Oops. Okay, the low data rate for us is 10 gigabits per second, right? 10 billion bits per second would be a very slow data rate. We are now, most of us in the industry are at the 50 and 100 gigabits per second and the 400 gigabits per second. We're working on 800 gigabits per second and beyond. A lot of the stuff we'll see coming all in the terabits per second. And I mean, to put it in perspective, your cell phone might do 1 megabit per second if you're lucky. Okay? So everything we work on is at least 10,000 times faster than any data rate you work on yourself. Okay? At least 10,000 times. All right? And in fact, a lot of the backbone of the network, we're trying to get to like 25 terabits. Okay, that's the speeds and things we work on. A typical module, like this is a 10 gig module probably, looks like this. You kind of see it there, it has like a fiber sticking out of it that sticks in. The module, if you open it up, you see all these pieces in there, and I can talk more about the pieces, but this module would stick into one of those big racks there, okay, and then they would connect, so you'd have hundreds of these sticking into a rack. Each of them 10 gigabits per second. You can imagine how much data is flowing through a rack like that. So it's well into the terabits. Okay? So that would be a very normal application for what I'm working on now. To do that, we have a lot of ICs that go into these things, these integrated circuits. An IC starts out as sand. Sometimes people don't realize that it's actually sand, but it's made out of sand, and I'll show you a little more about that. It ends up as a computer chip. We don't call them computer chips because we don't work on computers, we work on communication networks and systems. Okay. So one of the key technologies we use now is called silicon photonics. So we're trying to build photonics into integrated circuits, right? And that's a key piece of the technology we're going to do now. So a lot of stuff is going on in that industry. So I'll just talk a little bit more about integrated design, and I'll try to get out of this stuff. I know a lot of you are probably not familiar with it, but I thought it would be good to give you a background on it. Here's sort of like a picture of here's a sort of a picture of like a bunch of integrated circuits that are sitting on this green thing, which we call a PCB, a printed circuit board. And there are layers on the printed circuit board that actually connect all these PCBs together, right? They connect all these integrated circuits together. These are fairly low technology integrated circuits, but I just wanted to show you. So that inside, if you flipped one of these open, you'd see one of these in there. It's called a die. And inside the die, if you kind of zoomed in, you'd see one of those, which is the transistors that go into the die. So those transistors there are tiny, right? So to give you perspective, this is a little bit old technology. I think this is 14 nanometers. So a single transistor is 14 nanometers. I mean, if you think about what a nanometer is, I mean, I'm trying to think of what would give you. A ruler is a meter or something, 30 centimeters or something, right, for a ruler. And you're saying that a millimeter would be, 10 times smaller. A micrometer would be like, another 1,000 times smaller, and a nanometer would be another 1,000 times smaller. So you cannot see them. You cannot see so this is a zoomed in of a die. A die is usually a couple of millimeters. So this is zoomed in on a die. This is actually the Appel bionic chip. And one of these devices is sitting in here, and you're zooming in millions of times so you can see that, right? And in fact, in order to even look at those devices, you need special equipment, okay? So you're literally hundreds of millions of those devices, or billions of those devices on a single chip, a single die, okay? That's old technology, that's 14 nanometer. The current technology today we're in is 5 nanometers. So if you think about what a nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters, right? A billionth of a meter. So we'll have literally, maybe several hundred million transistors on one of these chips. Okay, and how do you actually make something of hundreds of millions of components? Okay, how do you connect them? And how do you make them run at 100 gigabits per second? So there's a lot of engineering challenges to it. It's actually, it takes a while, it takes a lot of stuff to learn how to do that, but there's a lot to it, okay? And there's usually a lot of people working on it. And when you have these chips, you see them everywhere, right? Every cell phone, every computer, everything you can think about has them on, okay? So some of the technical challenges that we often deal with in my world is optics is one. How do we connect the fibers and how do we get the light in and out? The EM, I don't know if you guys know what EM is, electromagnetics, right? All of this stuff is now, there's magnetic fields, things are all running. Once you get over a few hertz, I assume you all know what a hertz is. Once you get over a few hertz, then things start radiating and start going all kinds of crazy. So you have to study how those fields are. So there's a whole world around electromagnetics that's going on here that has to be studied. There's an awful lot of electromagnetics. Heat, all of these things, each one of these little devices gives off just a tiny amount of heat. But if you have 100 million of them, it doesn't matter if it only gives off a microwatt. It ends up in watts of heat that gets dissipated. So some of these things can dissipate 100 or 200 watts. They're like a bulb. And they're that small, dissipating 100 watts. So how do you get the heat out of that, right? So you have this small thing, there's maybe 100 watts or 200 watts in some of these things. How do I get 100 watts out of here? That's a big challenge. It's not so easy. So often we try to spec these things so we maybe only have 5 or 10 watts or 15 watts, you know, not 100 watts. So that's a big challenge that we have to deal with. Mechanically, this looks tiny. The amount of engineering it takes to get all the, there's lasers in here, there's photodetectors, there's many ICs, there's many components in here. How do you squash it all into something this small with that amount of power? So there's a lot of challenges just squashing stuff into this thing and getting it in there. So the mechanical challenges are very significant. And then you have to be able to drop it in all kinds of things without it getting damaged, right? So there's all kinds of shock tests and things that mechanically that have to, so that's a big challenge for us too. The next thing is just the electronics. You know, just connecting all this stuff, all these circuits have to work, right? And there are a lot of circuits in there. How do I make them all work? I just said to you there are 100 billion or something transistors. How do I make that work, you know? So those are some of the big challenges. Then a lot of the stuff has microcontrollers. I heard some of you talk about Arduino and stuff like that. So you have to control the functionality in there. So there's microcontrollers and little microprocessors all over in these things. So all of that requires firmware and software control to make this work. And usually that sits in a much bigger system which also has to be controlled by firmware and software. How do I pull that all together and make it all work together? So that is, all of this is a huge challenge, and at the end of the day you got to make it cheap because nobody wants to pay much for anything, right? So, you know, one of these modules might cost us $200 or something. It costs us 50 million to make. So that, and probably, I would say 1,000 people work on it, it costs 50 million, and we charge $200. Same thing with your cell phone, right? It costs 200 or 300 to make. There's probably 5,000 people work on a cell phone. It costs, you know, $1,000 for something. Okay? So that's the challenge of what we're doing. Just as a, just to give you a little more about what integrated circuit looks like, it starts out as sand. We melt the sand, we make it, this here called an ingot, or a buhl, sometimes you call it a buhl. And it's like a really pure glass, that's what effectively is. When you melt sand, you get glass out of it. You then slice it, we call this a wafer. We slice it into a thin wafer, okay? You take the wafers, and then we use a photolithography process. We take sort of like the images of the circuits we're going to do, we put a mask onto there, and then we etch it out. So that process, we call photolithography. And so then that's how we burn the circuits into the glass, okay? Once we do that, we take the wafers and we sort them, and then we singulate them. We carve each little piece of die out that makes a single chip. We call that singulation. And then we package it into some kind of package, which is what you saw on the printed circuit board, those plastic packages. So that's the singulation part. Well, there's probably 500 steps. I try to highlight the big ones, okay, so that you get a sense of how we actually make a computer chip. But this is how it starts from sand and then it ends up as a computer chip, which will end up on the printed circuit board. Okay, so that's kind of how we get to that point. I don't want to cover too much more about what I do because it gets very technical, but if you guys have questions, I'll leave some time at the end. You can ask anything about all the details, how it does. But I wanted to tell you some useful courses that would be useful to me, were very useful to me, all right? So if I was a freshman, a sophomore, or senior, the things I found most useful were in math classes, were probably some calculus, some probability and statistics. Most people avoid probability and statistics. It turns out to be one of the most important classes that we deal with on a regular basis. Because it turns out that everything we do has sort of a randomness to it, and you have to measure and understand the randomness. And once you understand the randomness, you understand the chance of, if I actually send a signal out, there's a certain probability that it will make it to the end, and you have to figure out that probability the signal will make it to the end correctly. And then you have to correct for that error. So probability turns out to be a lot more important than I ever imagined it was when I was in college. Linear algebra, there's just so much stuff that we end up doing that's related to linear algebra, at least in my world, you know. And then things that I found that were also useful just from a background standpoint is complex and real analysis. So if you were in math majors or physics majors, I would seriously consider these classes. And then you have to be able to program, so some kind of Python for scripting language and maybe C++. These would be absolutely essential sort of bare classes I would take. And I would take that now regardless of what field I was going into, whether I was going into electromagnetics, or I was going into mechanics or heat, or these things just come up over and over and over again. So if you're going into any one of these technical fields, you probably miss that. Okay, I would say I found these to be tremendously useful. Okay. Other useful courses, there's a whole bunch of other courses that I would say, as technical people, we take them for granted, right? So these are courses like, you might say, why would I need to do a philosophy course? Why would I need to do an English class? Why would I need to do psychology and public speaking? I would say the first few courses I gave you are useful when you're early in your career. When you're starting out and you're doing all the technical work, they're super useful to know how to do your job. So if I wanted to know how to make an IC chip, or make, whatever it is, a cell phone, or make a package, or whatever it is that I'm making, the first few courses are useful. But when you get further in your career, to the middle of your career, I'd say maybe 15 years into your career to 25 into your career, these are more important. These are the classes that will tell you why you're doing what you're doing in life. What's my philosophy of life? Why am I even doing this? Why don't I do something else? Why don't I be a music major? Why don't I go be a salesperson? At some point you have to answer that question to yourself. And that usually hits you about halfway through your career. And then you have to be able to write well, because as you get further in your career, you end up taking on more leadership roles. Those leadership roles mean that you're communicating more, you're speaking to people, you're presenting, you're at conferences, you're at, and all of those other things that are not related to your technical part, those become far more important, because no matter how good your ideas are, you have to sell them to someone. You say, I made the best computer chip in the planet. Well, I got to show somebody I made the best computer chip, because I have to do presentations and I have to go through that. So these start becoming far more important. And things like history, knowing why things happen, and what is the history of your technology or the history of your thing. All of these things start making public speaking. As you get further and further up, public speaking becomes essential. You might be leading a group of 1,000 engineers. You're going to have to speak to them at some point. You're going to have to speak to them in a public setting. So these things, I think when I was sort of a sophomore, freshman, college level, these things seem very secondary. Now I think they're more important. I think I would probably, for every engineering class, I'd take at least one of these. And I think most of you are required to take them, but I would say don't underestimate the value long term. Okay? This never ends. There's sort of a learning process. I think some people think when I get out of college, I'm done. I would say I've learned far more after college than I learned in college. Probably 2-to-1 ratio. Like I learned basics in college. But if you want to know how to actually do something, you have to do it after college is when you learn it, right? So I think those are things that I would say on a day-to-day, what do I actually do? Okay, most of the time, you'd think I'd spend most of my time on the computer, like working and designing stuff and like that. The honest truth, I spend most of my time in meetings. So most of the times we're collaborating, we're trying to figure out things, we're trying to plan things. Remember I said we got 1,000 engineers. How do we coordinate and make things actually work? Like how do I get everybody on the same page? How do we all agree on that we're building the same thing and we're doing that? So a lot of times that's done through meetings. Okay, so we spend a lot of meetings times and collaboration is key. I do spend a fair amount, I would say maybe something like 40% in meetings, maybe on the computer 30% of my time, in the lab 10 or 15% of my time. Once we build something, we have to measure it, and then coffee room. This is actually my cubicle. This is actually my computer. That's the lab we actually work on. That's a meeting, our meeting room, and this is us at a conference presenting an optical eye getting sent across the fiber. I don't know if you can see the fiber. A piece of equipment in the lab will cost $500,000 to $1 million at 100 meters per second. It's all very expensive equipment. It costs more than most people's houses. So you don't let anybody touch the equipment. So people always say, "Oh, can I try that?" No, you can't try that. You can't, right? And, all our stuff is on air tables. An air table is something we have compressed air that pushes it above, because it's all optics, so you can't have it on a table because any vibrations would mess with the optics. So we float it in the air and we put it on an air table. So that's a typical lab. Most labs probably cost tens of millions to build in our world. So, all right. I guess another thing we do a lot is coffee. I think we all spend an awful lot of time in coffee, and people underestimate the value of the coffee room. The coffee room is really important, and I'll tell you why. Because the coffee room, in a meeting or something, you'll have an agenda, and you'll focus on the agenda. If you really want to know how something works or how something is done, it's usually not discussed in the meeting. Okay? Usually in the meeting, you're making decisions. In a coffee room, you would discuss, you'd say, "I really didn't understand what you said. Could you explain it to me?" They'll say, "Okay, let me take the time, let me explain it to you." So whether it's a coffee room conversation or a hallway conversation, a lot of work gets done in the coffee room. So I would not undervalue the coffee room. Okay? So I would say I probably spend a good 5 to 10% of it. I would say it's key to your career, by the way, to spend time socializing with people in the coffee room. Very key. Okay? That's what I would do on a day-to-day basis. Most of the time, this is what I'm doing. I'm in meetings. I get there, I do 2 or 3 meetings a day. I do 2 or 3 hours on the computer. I go home, I work on the computer. Engineering is not a 9-to-5 job. So most of you will think it's a 9-to-5 job or something, you go there and work. Most of us work easily 60 hours a week, easily, right? And often when the project gets busy, it's more than that. We'll work weekends, we'll work nights, we'll work a lot of extra hours because it's project-based, so it really has to meet a deadline. There are very strict deadlines when it gets met, so you'll find you'll keep working more and more hours to meet the deadline. But there's the flip side of that is as soon as the project is done, we'll have very little or a lot of time, very little to do, and a lot of times so you'll have very short hours, and we'll often take time off that we'll actually be given time off. They'll say take 2 weeks off paid. That's not your vacation, it's just 2 weeks off paid. So there's a flip side to it, but often there's a lot of hours, a lot of weekends, a lot of nights. So that's very normal in most engineering industries out there. And that's just the way that the industry is. It's project-based, so you have to meet those deadlines. Okay? The next thing I would say is that I do a lot of travel too, right? It's just one of those things where it turns out, I've been to a lot of different countries, a lot of different places. As part of work, we go to conferences. They're usually in California or in Europe. Go to a lot of face-to-face meetings. So, I'm in San Diego, I'm in Israel, I'm in Italy. I'm at a training session in Michigan at the Moravian thing. So we're all over. There's a lot of traveling. There's a sort of fun site work where you're all over the place traveling and doing this stuff. On the other side, what are sort of important skills you want to know for work? Okay, so these are things where I would say these are things that I found to be extremely useful. So there was courses and then there's things I need to do. I need to learn how to model things. Okay, so it turns out that you have to make decisions about things, and in order to make decisions, you have to model it. And so we find that the most common way we model things is either we build physical models, or we model them mathematically. Most of the times now they're modeled mathematically. And that's regardless of which engineering field you're in. Whether it's mechanical, you'll have some kind of mathematical modeling field, or whether it's in electromagnetics, we have a bunch of different tools for that. So all of these have tools. So I would learn something like MATLAB. It's a very common tool we use to model things. Some of you have probably been exposed to MATLAB, but there are other ones. There's also some Python tools that we use. Just programming in general, it never seems to end. You can keep learning programming. The other thing I keep finding is that there's other related engineering fields. You think you're an electrical engineer, but then you end up doing math, mechanical engineering, physics, everything under the sun, even though it's not directly related to your field. So there's an absolute need when you're in college, regardless of what your field is, try to take a couple of other fields outside of that. So if you think you're a physicist, try to take some chemistry or try to take something. I cannot tell you how many times it's come up that I need to know something about a different field. So, and the last things I would say is, just being able to manage a spreadsheet. Almost everything we do at some point, you have to spreadsheet it and make a trade-off. So you have to be able to draw the trade-offs and draw it out on a spreadsheet. So your Excel skills are important. Like, can you reference the sheet? Can you color code? all those kinds of things are important because at some point you have to make a decision. You're probably going to spreadsheet your decision and then you're going to make it. Or you're going to cost analysis. You're going to say, how much does each component cost? Well, I got to put in a spreadsheet and I got to figure out how much each component costs. So those kinds of skills over and over again keep coming up. So they're worth learning now and they'll be very useful probably for your lifetime. I learned spreadsheeting probably when I was 16 and it's been useful for the last 30 years. So the other thing I would say is we mostly work in Linux and Unix, so most science is not done on the PC or the Mac, right? We work on Unix-based systems. So if you can teach yourself a little bit of Unix, you can go navigate the directories, maybe do some scripting, maybe do some compiling, write some code or something like that in those languages, that would be very useful. That is our primary, most of us use, even though I have a Mac, the first thing I do is I log in to a Unix system to work. Okay? So those are the things I would say, just some quick takeaway skills that if I wanted to learn them, that's what I would learn now. In fact, most of the times when folks start, when we hire somebody new, most of them do not know Unix, they do not know how to script, and Programming skills are not very good. And in fact, the first year almost is just trying to teach those very basic skills so that you can actually do a job and function. So if you have them coming in, they're very useful. Okay? Non-technical skills. We talked about communication. I cannot overstress communication. Your career trajectory is tied to your communication skills. If you cannot communicate, you will not move up the ladder. There's just no way around it. Your ability to collaborate with other people. We work in teams of 1,000 people. We work small teams of 10 people, 500 to 1,000 people. If you cannot collaborate, you will not move up the chain. You will not. Okay? Your interpersonal skills, how you handle dealing with somebody else is really important. I've worked with people who slam the desk and yell and scream and break things and all of that kind of stuff. You can imagine what happens to them. Usually they're gone within a week or two. So if your behavior is inappropriate and you cannot work with other people, you will not last long in any of these careers. Your emotional intelligence, your ability to be able to detect what's going on in the room. You have a CEO in the room and he's angry. If you cannot tell he's angry, you're probably going to get fired. So just so you know. So your ability to detect what's going on in the room and understand what's going on is really important. Your attitude and your diligence to work. So a lot of people work, and they kind of work, but they don't want to put it all in. That really matters. And I would say the last two things are your presentation skills, how well you present to an audience, super important, and your organizational skills, how well you're organized. You'll find that there's so much work we have to do, it is overwhelming most of the time. And I'm sure you feel that in college. And multiply that by 3x, 5x. You're going to feel overwhelmed for sure. Your ability to organize is important. One of the tools we use is OneNote. I don't know if you guys know OneNote from Microsoft. It's one of the tools we use quite a bit to try to help organize across different organizations. So if you have good organizational skills, that's something within. These are the things I would say I was really bad at, and I've been learning over the years I need to get much, much better at. You know, how I do these things. They've turned out to be so important now at this point in my career. And so I wanted to share them with you so you understand it. Don't neglect them. Start early. If you can present, if you can, what's this one? If you can join a club where you're presenting, if you can join a club where you're doing leadership or organization or anything you can do to learn somebody's skills now, I would do them now. Like anything you can do in this time. So the other thing I would say to you is I wanted to cover a quick product cycle. I don't know how I'm doing for time. How do we make a product? This is one of the things I said we're going to tell you about. How do we actually make a product? So it starts off with market demand. So Netflix comes out and they're like, you know, we're streaming video now, and everybody wants to, you know, send gigabits of data to watch their videos. So there's a new market demand that comes out. So how does that translate to us, right? We somehow have to address that there's a market demand coming out. So what would end up happening is somebody would say, well, Netflix is transmitting so many gigabits of data per user, so many users, there's 50 million users, that's 50 million gigabits of data per day, and they'd work all the way through and say, okay, that means that my module at the end needs to produce 10 gigabits per second per module, and I need 1,000 modules or 1 million modules or whatever. So somebody will do that marketing analysis, marketing person, technical marketing person, and would come back to us and say, guys, this is what we need. Okay? That would translate to a technical specification for us. So somebody would actually write a document, typically me, would write a document saying, this is exactly how we build this. This is how we build it so we can meet that market need. Okay? Once that's done, we'll go into a design phase where we'll actually do all the design stuff I talked about earlier, where we build the chips and we build the modules and the PCB boards and all that kind of stuff. Then we'll go into verification stage where we kind of verify the design, but we actually haven't built it yet. We're just verifying that it works that way. We usually do that through computer simulations. Then we go into prototype where we build the first set of prototypes to see how it actually works. Once we prototype, we do a validation step, where we're in the lab testing it now and seeing if it's validating that it actually met the specifications we wrote down originally. All right. Once we get past the validation, we go into productization step, where we have to take it from building one prototype to building 100,000 or 1 million of them, or more. Like in cell phones, they produce 1 billion of them a year. Right? How do we do that? So then, once that kind of works and we productize it, then we look do some system testing. In our case, we put thousands of these into a system and see if the system runs, okay, and if there's any issues with it. Once we've done system tests, we do qualification. Qualification means we run it through heat cycles, we run it through all kinds of crazy things to make sure it doesn't break when it's stressed. Okay, that's qualification. Then we do customer testing, where we give it a bunch of customers. In our case, that's Google, Facebook, everybody you can think of, right? Amazon, Microsoft, every government, every school. Every one of you guys probably is going to be somewhere in the building somewhere, right? And so we give it to them, they test it, and then after that we say, okay, it's good. We start ramping up production, okay? So at that point we try to ramp up, that's when we make our money. It usually takes us 4 years to get from that idea to here, to this ramp up production. Usually once we send it out, we get returns, damaged parts, things are broken. We come back, we try to figure out why they're broken and see if we need to address that. If we do, we sometimes go back and design more. After that, we end of life it. You have to at some point stop making them. The iPhone 3 is gone, right? You have to say it's done, and you have to stop producing the firmware and the software and everything for it at the end of life it. So this would be like a really typical cycle for us. And from the beginning to the end, this might be 15 years, or 10 to 15 years, right? So by the time you end of life a product, you've taken 4 years to make it, you sold it for 10 years, and then you end of life it. The last product I worked on, we made $1 billion. So $1 billion in sales. Okay? And over, I would say, about 15 years, 14 years. Okay? I just wanted to cover salaries. This is like an interesting topic for most people. How much does an engineer make? I think you should all know what you're worth when you go out and negotiate from the technical field. So very typical salary in our field. It's specific to which field you're in. It's specific to which area you're in. So whether you're in California or whether you're in Lehigh Valley makes a difference. There's usually like a 20% difference in California versus Lehigh Valley, or 25% difference. It also matters whether you're in IC design or you work for PP&L, for example, or something else. Even though you might be all electrical engineers, it may not all be the same. So that does matter. You should know before you get to the table what you're worth. You need to know that when you get to the table. A lot of people like come out of school and they're like so happy to get a job. They have no idea what their market rate should be. Understand your market rate when you get to the negotiation table, because it is a negotiation, right? They want to get you at the low end and you want to get at the high end. Make sure you understand what you're worth. I would say in our field, we typically pay in the range something in the $60,000 to $85,000 range for a bachelor's degree if you come into our area. Master's is in the $75,000 to $110,000 range. PhDs are $90,000 to $100,000 starting salaries. So this would be very normal engineering starting salaries. Okay. If you're an experienced engineer, you can make anywhere from 100 to 500K, and 500K actually you can be low on the low end, right? Because it depends what you did. For example, I used to work with people who had invented the C language, or C++, and people who had invented the transistor, and people who had invented half the things you can think of. They're at the very high end, right? So if you came out with C++ and the whole world is using C++ today, you'd probably make $1 million a year. You're probably famous, and everybody wants to be your friend, right? It's just the truth, right? So I worked with some of those people when I worked at AT&T Bell Labs, and that's the ranges. So they would be on the high range. There tend to be, in big companies like Cisco, people who are at the 500K plus range, they're only making 20 of them in a company. And we have 30,000 or 40,000 engineers. So it's the very high end that are in that range. The 100K to 250K or 300K is very common. There are many, many engineers in that range. Okay, that's a very common range. The other thing I did do is I did work for a startup. So I worked for a startup, and a startup I worked for got bought out by Cisco. Okay, and so in that range, I mean, the sky's the limit. You can make any amount of money. So the people I work with who have made, probably half the people I work with are millionaires. The other half, one or two of them are made tens of millions, and one of them is worth, the founder of the startup is worth like $300–400 million. So that range, once you start your own company, there is no limit to what your upper limit is kind of. Think about all the people, Facebook and all these people, there is no limit to it, right? So if you go into the startup, I would warn you though, most startups like 9 out of 10 or 19 out of 20 fail, right? So it's sort of, I have a friend who went through 4 or 5 of them, and they all failed. And eventually he gave up and just went to work for Google. So there's just no guarantee in this stuff. Yeah, if you hit it big, you hit it big, but chances are you're not going to hit it, right? So that's the honest truth. So I thought it was kind of interesting to see where they are. I would tell you the next thing is like, what's hot right now? This what's really going on in terms of what I hear a lot of people talking about is obviously AI. If you're doing any kind of artificial intelligence right now, there's a lot of people looking for you, and a lot of the software people I've heard have got jobs like, before they even got out of college, they got 2 or 3 offers, right? So So these fields are sort of, AI is everywhere. It's in your phones, it's in your cars, it's in self-driving cars, all that kind of stuff. It's in there. Security, so cybersecurity is super hot too right now. So if you're doing any kind of cybersecurity, you're probably going to get a job almost guaranteed. Same with data analytics. Any kind of data analytics is really hot. You're probably going to get a job there too. Quantum computing is one of those fields that's not here yet. That's a quantum computer over there, by the way. It's not here yet, but it's coming. Okay, and it's going to be hot too. And I'm almost done now. In terms of careers in engineering, most people change careers at some point, okay? So many of the people I know, they go out of like traditional day-to-day engineering and they switch into engineering leadership, where they're leading engineers. So that as you get further along, you tend to be in the leadership roles. They go into technical sales, they go into technical marketing. There are a lot of engineers, ironically, who become doctors. If you ask your doctors what they did before, they'll tell you they were engineers. Quite a few of them, right? There's a lot of them going to MBAs and business side. Quite a few of my friends have gone into MBAs. And a lot of them go into patent law as well. And then some of them go into businesses and start companies and stuff like that. The reason this works is because I've never heard people going the other way. I've never heard somebody say I went from a lawyer to an engineer. That's never happened. I've never heard a doctor say I became an engineer. And I've never heard any of the other things, an MBA person say I became an engineer. It's much harder to go in one of those fields to engineering than engineering to one of those fields. And that's really because the engineering kind of gives you a really good baseline. And then you can sort of springboard to all the others. So sort of an advertisement for engineering. But I would say, I wouldn't think of engineering as necessarily the only career you'll ever have. So the last thing I would say is, yeah, that's me as kids, is that you, at the end of the day, you kind of have to make it all work. And so you better have other things you do. Because you're working 60 hours a day, you're tired, you're exhausted, you might get paid a good salary, but it is exhausting. So you better have other things. I used to play squash in college. I don't know if you guys know what squash is. I used to do a little bit of taekwondo, running, biking, swimming. I travel. I do Broadway shows. I go to the casino. I gamble. Hey, I dance. You know, so I do all these other things because if you don't do those things, it just turns out that it's just very hectic. It's 25 or 30 years or 40 years of working on something 60 hours, 70 hours a day. And so that's why I said at some point the philosophy part comes in is why am I doing this, right? So you have to think about those kinds of questions when you get into it. Okay, so that's all I had in the prepared presentation. So if you guys want to ask any questions about any specific part from the technical side to the money side to the how do I get an internship or, you know, Cisco hiring or Cisco looking for internships, go ahead.
How do you apply for said internship at your company?
You just need to send me a resume probably. Sometimes people miss the internship cycle. That if you wanted to get an internship in this summer, you should have probably applied last November. Okay, most people think is, oh, if I want an internship in the summer, I'll just apply 2 weeks before. Cisco's not waiting for you, right? You know, they've got thousands of other people applying and stuff like that, so they have to go through the process of sorting and organizing and making hiring offers and all that. So you have to give them enough time to hire. So, but we typically hire a few internships. I would say we hire at our location 2 or 3 Cisco-wise, probably a few hundred every year, and every company has internships. But apply early is what I want. Most of the times they're very open to that. I know we have a lot of people with only a year or 2, and we usually will teach you something. You'll come away and we pay well. We probably pay $20 to $30 an hour, so something like that. Yeah.
Would you be willing to share your contact details so that they can apply for said internships in November?
Sure, I would be willing to share my contact details for said internships. But yeah, but just apply early. We hired a couple of kids last year that were doing software for us. They'd done some software experience. Somebody had done an Adreno, someone had done. So we had them do like little software projects and things like that. So if you've got that kind of background, we had done that. If you have a circuit design background, certainly if you have optics design background, that would be great. If you have none of those backgrounds, we can still find somebody to use you most of the times. You know, but we only have a couple of positions, so you know, I would say it's not one of those things where we hire 10 people, we hire 2 or 3 because we have to work with you and we have to take time out. Anything else?
Thank you guys for coming.
If you didn't sign sheets are up in the corner over here. The pink sheets for Dr. Milletta's class, the yellow sheet is for Dr. Milletta's class.
Hopefully that was informative. Did everybody learn something?